Hello, my name is Dan Caldwell, and I'm the Senior Advisor for Concerned Veterans for America. I'm honored today to be joined by Senator Rand Paul for a discussion on America's foreign policy with a focus on our nation's endless wars. Senator Rand Paul has represented Kentucky in the United States Senate since 2011 and has been one of the most outspoken advocates for bringing our troops home from our forever wars and for restoring Congress's role in matters of war and peace. Senator Paul, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks a lot, Dan. I, like many American families, have a lot of family members who have served in the military. And I know how important it is that when we make decisions in Washington, that we think about the individuals involved. My father-in-law was an enlisted guy for 20 years in the Air Force. I have a nephew who's been 20 years in the Navy, a couple other nephews who were enlisted, several officers, a brother-in-law that went to the Air Force Academy. But when I think about war and I think about trying to make these difficult decisions, I think about family members and I think about individuals. And I think part of the mistakes we make when thinking about foreign policy or war is that we think about it sort of as a giant chess game or a geopolitical game of sorts or a strategy, and not really think about the individuals who actually have to fight the war. So to me, I think there's nothing probably more important as far as my role as a legislator than in deciding, and hearing the arguments about whether or not we should go to war. And I really think it's a terrible lapse and a terrible, problem that Congress just doesn't even address these problems. It's not that somehow we're having a debate and I think we shouldn't go to war and other people think we should go to war. No, it's just that no debate occurs at all. So as you know, we voted in 2001, 20 years ago, to go to war in Afghanistan or to go to war against those who attacked us on 9/11 or who aided and abetted those who attacked us on 9/11. And yet, without any other vote in Congress in 20 years, they've now used that proclamation to justify war in maybe 20 countries. So I think it is high time that we re-debate whether or not we should be at war. I supported President Trump bringing troops out of Afghanistan, and I support President Biden. I think it's actually one area where we ought to be able to get some bipartisan support is in ending some of these wars. I'll believe it when it actually happens, though. I think sometimes people say it's going to happen, then they leave a few thousand troops, then something else happens, and before you know it, we're back up to 10, 20, 30,000 troops again. So I'm a big believer that we should declare victory. We should declare victory. We did win. We defeated those who attacked us on 9/11. We defeated even the government, the Taliban government at that time that aided and abetted them. But really, that war has been over probably for 18 to 19 years now. And yet, in the meantime, we've been doing something else, nation building. We have been building roads and schools. And you could say, well, that's great and a humanitarian. Or you could look at it and say, well, does that detract from things that we actually need to be repairing and fixing and replacing here at home? And should our obligation be worldwide to repair everyone else's infrastructure at the expense of ours? So I do think there needs to be a debate. In Congress in the last year or so, Tim Kaine and others came forward and said we need to, narrow the scope of the 2001 authorization for war. And yet, when I read their bill, the worry I have is that the narrowing of the focus actually, from our reading, looks like we could still be at war in 24 different countries under the Tim Kaine proclamations. So I've been I've been an opponent of that. Really, to my thinking, the answer is we should let all of them expire. We should go ahead and end the AUMF, not only for Afghanistan, for the first war in Iraq, the second war, the third war in Iraq. All the different AUMFs should expire. And if people want to go to war somewhere, they should come to Congress and say, hey, we want to send 1,000 troops to Somalia. This is why. Or we want to send 500 troops to Niger or Mali. This is why. And we should have a vote. And I don't like the idea of any kind of carte blanche from some time in history that allows this war to go on forever. So I'm hopeful, or at least a little bit hopeful, that the war will end in Afghanistan and soon. I hope we do the same in Iraq, frankly. But I think some people are now talking about shifting the troops from Afghanistan, putting them in Iraq and calling it a day. I really hope for less of a presence overseas and more of, when we go to war, we have to actually vote on it.
Well, Senator, I think you just laid out a compelling reason why we should have brought home our troops from Afghanistan long ago and laid out what we accomplished and what we needed to do. it sounds like that you are somewhat confident that the Biden administration is going to bring all our troops home from Afghanistan. So are you hopeful that they will actually accomplish this goal and bring our troops home by September, if not earlier?
I'll believe it when I see it. My first thought is to be skeptical of anything government tells you, because government's also often a false promiser. They often promise you things, and then somebody figures out a way to change it. I will say that the American people are in favor of coming home from Afghanistan and Iraq. The American people are very much on our side on this issue. But if you poll Congress, it's probably the opposite. While 75% of Americans probably would like to come home from Afghanistan, 75% of Congress wants to stay. This is a real problem, and it's a bipartisan problem. There is a bipartisan consensus on foreign policy, but their consensus is to stay forever. So you hear the grumbling, particularly in the Republican leadership in the Senate cloakroom. I hear them every day talk about how unhappy they are that the war might end in Afghanistan. I think public opinion's against them, but I fear they will do everything possible. I don't think they will create situations that would have us stay, but if anything occurs, they will gin that situation up to try to use that situation to keep us in place. So we'll believe it when all the troops are gone, but I have a feeling they may say, oh, the war's over, we're leaving 2,000 there in the embassy. And so, 2,000 troops is probably just enough to get in trouble, but not enough to actually really win a lot of battles. And so there is a danger of going halfway. I think it's better to go virtually to zero. And if the Afghanis cannot protect your embassy, then that's a reason to not have an embassy, frankly. But if we have to have 2,000 to defend an embassy, there is a real question. And a lot of military guys will tell me, I'd rather either go big or go home. I'd rather have enough presence there that we can actually fight a war and win it. But I'd rather not be trapped with a small amount of people that could be surrounded. So I really hope we get down to just what we'd normally have for an embassy there. But I'll believe that when I actually see it happen.
I totally understand that. And that's why oversight and vigilance is so important. But you mentioned earlier a lot of your colleagues and how there seems to be a disconnect between them and where a lot of the American people, including veterans like myself, are in foreign policy. So this, I think, leads well into my next question, is that a lot of the same people who are saying that we shouldn't withdraw from Afghanistan are the same people who said that invading Iraq would lead to democracy in the Middle East, that overthrowing Gaddafi in Libya would help the Libyan people, and that arming so-called moderate rebels in Syria was the best course of action in that country. The point being that in the foreign policy debate and in others, the so-called serious voices are usually the ones who have been wrong about everything in foreign policy over the last 20 years. Why isn't there any accountability in the foreign policy establishment? And why do so many of your colleagues still listen to people who have been wrong again and again over the last 20 years?
It's sort of amazing that they're not very evidence-based. They don't seem to look at what has happened. And I always say, look at the history of unintended consequences of both the Libyan war, the Iraq war, Afghan war. You look at the unintended consequences, but they seem to be some consistency that when we do regime change, when we topple the iron fist, the strong man in the Middle East, they're replaced often with either chaos or no government, or ultimately with another iron fist. But they're not often replaced with sort of Jeffersonian democracy. And I think it's a naivete that says or misunderstands that you can just transplant the ideas that evolved in both the English tradition and then the American tradition, and you can just sort of put that into a situation where it's never sort of existed. I think we don't give enough thought to the fact that our Republican form of government evolved from a distrust of central government that goes back to probably 1000 AD and the first resistance of the barons, against the king, even predating Runnymede and predating Magna Carta. So I think that long tradition, it's 1,000, 2,000, 1,500 years is a long tradition of resisting central power, whereas in the Middle East, the tradition really is a tribal tradition of that a strong person becomes strong enough to lead their tribe and sometimes strong enough to lead other tribes. But it's based on military might and force, but not really on democracy. So we've tried, and there is some institutions that are, involve voting in Iraq today. But if you look at it from a global perspective, you can also say that, Iraq is now much more aligned with Iran, and that the balance of power between Iraq and Iran is now shifted in Iran's favor because of us toppling Hussein. So I don't know. The people up here refuse to sort of acknowledge their past errors. As President Biden brought all of his appointees forward, he brought a bunch of them who were claiming, like Secretary Blinken, for example, claimed that the problem in Syria was not that we did too much, but that we did too little. And that really his recommendation sounds like, either a surge like we did in Afghanistan or a surge like we did in Iraq with 100,000 troops is what we should have done in Syria. And I think that misses the real understanding that should come from this. And that's that regime change doesn't work, and that going in and toppling Assad, while he may be a menace to his own people, doesn't necessarily guarantee that the next person will be any better.
I totally agree, Senator. I hope that some of these changes that we're seeing, some of this new bipartisan consensus against forever wars and against regime change, will hopefully cause more of your colleagues to think differently about this. But kind of sticking with this theme of Congress and behavior of individual members. At the beginning of your remarks, you were talking about AMF repealing the 2001 authorization for use of military force, which authorized our invasion in Afghanistan, but which has been abused to justify intervention far afield from Afghanistan against groups that didn't even exist on 9/11. And then the 2002 AMF repeal, which would undo the authorization for use of military force that authorized the ill-fated invasion of Iraq. There is, fortunately, it seems like more and more members supporting these repeals, but you still have a lot of members resisting doing anything about these AUMFs, even on things like the 2000 AUMF repeal, which would be an important step, but it's really easy and kind of common sense to do. Is the reason why so many of your colleagues are still opposing this is because they quite simply don't want to be held accountable for failures in foreign policy? Or do they legitimately believe that these laws need to be left on the books to help keep America safe?
They legitimately do believe that America is this indispensable country that should be everywhere all the time, and that we were a force for good, so we should be out there, promoting good everywhere. They fail to see the unintended consequences of this. I will tell you that the libertarian-leaning Republicans in the Senate and the House, and also some of the very progressive-leaning Democrats in the House and the Senate, that's where the actual coalition is occurring. Unfortunately, 75% of both the House and the Senate, Republicans and Democrats, are in the hawkish variety. And I'll give you an example of how hawkish they are. When President Trump decided that 200 troops facing a Turkish army of 100,000, it was not wise to keep them right there confronting 100,000 troops who announced to America that they were coming into Syria, and he simply moved them to a different place in Syria. They went crazy up here. McConnell and all the other, hawks, Democrats, Republicans, that came together, and within a few days, they passed a resolution condemning President Trump for moving 200 troops out of the way of 100,000. And the only regret I have is that he didn't move them completely out of the country. He moved them within the country. But it still was the only decision to be made. Even before he made the decision, the Turkish army had already advanced into the area, and the troops were actually being shelled, even though they had announced they were going to retreat or be relocated. But this is how hawkish these people are, is they can't stand even movement of troops around, much less removing troops. Then the Dick Cheney basically, or not the Dick Cheney, the Liz Cheney amendment came forward and said basically any kind of movement of troops would have to be approved by Congress. And this was the great contradiction, because these were the people who always said, oh, we only need one general, only the president can make troop decisions. Now they were saying, oh, unless the president tries to remove troops, in which case Congress would have to make the decisions.
I want to thank you for joining us today and taking time out of your very busy schedule to talk about these important issues. Are there any final thoughts you'd like to share before we wrap up our conversation?
Just to hang in there and keep trying to influence Congress for less wars. I think the people are with us on this, and ultimately we can transform and get a better Congress. the one good thing in the Republican Party that happened with President Trump is he was open to the ideas. Unfortunately, didn't always appoint the right people to effectuate those ideas, but he was open to the idea of less intervention and less troops. He actually said in a State of the Union that great nations don't fight perpetual wars. Now, you could see that as only rhetoric, but at the same time, I think that as at least rhetoric headed in the right direction. I'm hopeful that now with Biden in place, that some of the hysteria from the left, where they wouldn't help Trump leave any war because they hated him so much, that maybe if it's their own president, look, I'm perfectly willing to help a Democrat end any of the wars if they'll do it. But some of the Democrats weren't so helpful when it was Trump. We'll see if they're more helpful under a President Biden administration. But thanks for having me. We'll talk again soon.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Paul.